My name is Daniel Slunge. That's how we pronounce it in Swedish. It's not that easy. I'm based at the University of Gothenburg. I'm an environmental economist, and we run a master's course on strategic environmental assessment one time a year, where we have students from many different countries, and we do this together with the Department of Law, Department of Political Science, and also the Department of Environmental System Analysis. And last year we had this very talented student from Vietnam, Trang, and she could not be here today, unfortunately. But what I'm going to present is based on her master's thesis that she conducted this spring, this year, where she went to Vietnam and did interviews with a lot of SCA practitioners and experts, Vietnamese and international experts, to try to take stock of the introduction of SCA in Vietnam and to identify some challenges for institutionalizing SCA in Vietnam now when big donors are pulling out, and what will happen then, what are the big challenges. We also have another co-author, which is David Annandale, who is here at the conference. He has been working at the Ministry of Planning and Investment in Vietnam for several years during this SCA introduction based on a contract financed by the Danish Development Cooperation Agency. So I will basically describe very briefly a bit of the introduction and some of the lessons learned, achievements and lessons learned that have come up during these interviews, and then talk about some of these challenges that we have identified. And this is very much a work in progress. We think that it's a rich experience that we would like to work a bit more on and try to publish it in some kind of journal here later on this year. We'll see. But I would like to start with a quiz. So, who are these people, and why do they look so happy? Anyone? Any idea? Anyone? This guy has a telephone in his ear. He gets a message. They all have received the Nobel Prize in Economics. So this is Douglas North, Oliver Williamson, and Elinor Ostrom, who have all gotten this prize at different moments of time for their work on the role of institutions for shaping the behavior of humans, individuals, and organizations and societies. And just, I mean, it's a very rich literature on it, but what they say is that institutions, first of all, it's both formal rules and informal rules, and they tend to be very persistent to change. This is from Oliver Williamson, a kind of review article, where he says that, well, many of these kind of customs, traditions, and norms, they tend to change extremely slowly, according to him. And then there are the formal rules of the game, the judiciary, bureaucracy. Maybe you talk about time spans of 10 to 100 years, where you have the play of the game, which is more kind of the contracts within the system and so on, and also maybe how you arrange some of the organization and so on, that could be changed more rapidly. But what this tells us then is that we should not accept or expect changes to take place very rapidly when you transplant kind of a formal institution developed in a European setting or an American setting into another context with another informal rules. So that was our basic kind of starting point for this analysis, and let's have that in mind. What we are talking about, and when we talk about institutionalization of SCA, is that, well, there is sufficient expertise to undertake, review, and use SCA. There's a sound legal and financial basis for SCA. there is an institutional structure with clear roles and mandates. If you have ideas on this kind of definition, it's a working definition, I would be happy to discuss that. What could we add to that? So, introduction of SEA in Vietnam. Vietnam is a front runner among developing countries regarding SEA. There was a legislation in 2005, there's been subsequent guidelines, there's been many different SEA pilots, I will come back to that. Large training programs, Swedish SIDA had a large program with many different trainings, etc. And there's then been a development of an institutional structure with the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, the Ministry of Planning and Investment, etc. have different roles in this system. And this has been done with a very strong support from development agencies. There is a session, I think, the next session, where in the development cooperation section, where they talk about coordination around SEA, development agencies coordination, because there are so many of them, particularly in Vietnam. So there's been more than 50 pilot SEAs SEAs undertaken in Vietnam around land use planning, socio-economic development plans, and power development plans, etc. I won't go through that. But they have involved different ministries and different administrative levels. At the provincial level, there have been a range of SEAs, different sector strategies involving Ministry of Industry and Trade, Agriculture, Transportation, Defense, etc. Just to give you a view that, well, things are definitely happening, and they're piloting many things and so on. Achievements. Well, let me emphasize that we have not evaluated any achievements, but these are things that are kind of surfaced in the interviews. I think it would be interesting to do more of a formal evaluation around that. I think many donors would be interested in that, or maybe not, I don't know, to see what have the results been of these investments then. But of course, an increased capacity to undertake SEA, there have been some concrete changes in plans due to some of the pilots. It has highlighted weaknesses in the planning system in Vietnam, which I think is an achievement in some way also. And it has increased the level of coordination and participation, although it's, as we will see, it's not at all perfect. And there are probably many other achievements. Some of the lessons learned, also based on these interviews, etc. Well, that legislating on SEA has been necessary, but maybe not sufficient then for incentivizing ministries and agencies. Otherwise, if with no legislation, many say that then nothing would have been done. Some say that they started a bit too broad with the first legislation and having to cover too much. So the now and the revision that they're doing now is more selective, so you do more full SEAs on a certain types of plans, and you do have less requirements for other types of plans, etc. So a more marked screening procedure. Then, good to have a lead agency for this, with the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources when it comes to issuing regulations and so on, and also for training and so on. But also that there is a need for a very clear definition of roles and mandates. There's been a lot of trainings on how to do SEA, maybe not enough on how to appraise SEAs, how to the appraisal system, and also how to use the information in SEAs. There could be maybe been more targeted trainings to decision makers and what's the value of SEA, and there's a frequent complaint of that at the top they don't understand the good value of this. What the continuous and strong support from donors have been instrumental to these changes. And the question is now, when SIDA and Danida have pulled out from this, and what will happen? Can the system stand on its own? And I will now quickly go through some of these challenges, and we have studied that at different levels. So at the micro level, we talk more on the individual level mainly. Well, as I said, low awareness among senior officials of the value that SEA can bring to decision making. Budgets for SEA training and for conducting specific SEAs are not very big, which results in poor quality SEAs. And also, if you have a low budget and you don't have time to do it, there are low incentives for civil servants to conduct SEAs. And that it comes from a very strong IAIA tradition, so some of the SEA practitioners tend to be very detailed and maybe not capturing the more strategic issues. Well, normally these are the things that you try to address through, and can be quite easily addressed maybe through trainings and more resources into the system. And what's kind of a lack of explanations to why things are not happening can be rather easily addressed. But when we come to the meso level, the organizational level, that's a different kind of challenges. And two of those are that there's an incohesive planning practice, so plans are not coordinated really, and there's a very strong top-down silo planning culture that gives low incentive for coordination and information sharing. I talked to Jiri here yesterday, who has also worked a lot in Vietnam, and he said there's this privatization of the bureaucratic system, which is very much then to get things going. If it's within your network, then it's easy. Otherwise, it can be blocked by these kind of informal rules and bonds. Tran gave me this illustration, this picture is supposed to illustrate this. Apparently, when they have built, this is from Hanoi, when they have put a new surface on the roads in Hanoi, the old city, it's very frequent that it's flooded. They didn't have that before. And apparently, according to Tran, it's because they have not coordinated with those in charge of the drainage system, etc. in Hanoi. So the water cannot disappear anymore, and that's, well, could have coordinated that better. They didn't have that problem before. Interestingly enough, the two other co-authors have different views on why is this. So David, he talks about, well, it's the Confucian culture. It goes way back, and where it's very strong, family and so on. And Tran says, no, then it would take hundreds of years to change because it's so old. So she thinks it's more related to the legacy of the political system in Vietnam and how the government is organized. So we'll have to discuss that further. Other challenges at this level is that there is very limited transparency and access to information. They say that some ministries, they treat information as their own property. There's no tradition and incentive really to give it away for free. And of course, there's very limited public participation in Vietnam. There's hardly no, but in the SEA system, there is some participation with different official bodies and so on. But there's no public participation.
You're the only speaker at the moment in the room, so keep going.
Thank you. I think I only have a couple of slides, but we'll have time for discussion then. And then at the macro level, even beyond the organizational level, well, talk about the kind of thinking on development. And I mean, it's a very strong focus on economic growth in Vietnam, and the environmental concerns are not given political priority. Then it's difficult to get these changes with any SEA system. And of course, introducing SEA in a one-party system is quite different, and it works differently than if you have a democracy. So you have the one-party system that in one way works in parallel to the government system, and decisions are made, and so it's difficult to make SEAs on those on that planning system, and a weak lawmaking system where I hear different things here that, well, some say that, well, laws don't mean anything. What you have on paper is one thing, but then it's much more important what leading people say. If the Prime Minister says something, then everyone will do it, even though it's not written in law. And also that higher level ranked officials that have enormous power on their disciples. On the other hand, Algeria tells me that well, the lawmaking system can be used if people want to make trouble for others. It can be really strong and effective and so on. So, but it's not kind of evenly applied and equal for all. So, to sum up, well, there's been substantial efforts to introduce SEA in Vietnam, and definitely has been some achievements. It would be interesting to evaluate that. And there are substantial challenges then to institutionalize SEA in the country. And I think that the informal rules are key to understand how the SEA system works. And then it would be interesting to have another slide on with very good recommendations on the way forward, etc. I don't have that. Thank you. Work in progress, and comments are extremely welcome at this moment.
Okay, thank you, Dan. As we've got, Martin is obviously kept from his presentation, isn't here yet, so we've got some time for some questions here if you're willing to answer any questions.
Yeah, as far as I can though. I mean, I would love to have had my two co-authors here with me, but
are there any immediate questions?
Marcelo from Brazil, University of São Paulo. Thanks for your presentation. I want to clarify what you said about this difference between the introduction and the institutionalization. What is the basic difference? Why did you separate this in two moments?
Well, I'm thinking of it that, well, especially in a developing country where you have such strong donor support, I mean, that will not be there forever. So, I mean, it's the you know, you don't give people fish, you learn them how to fish, right? Yeah, the old story. When the donors draw back, will this system work? Will it be institutionalized? Will it be a part of the normal procedure, the normal systems? Will they find resources for doing SEAs, or will it simply evaporate if there is no external support? So, being kind of a normal and ordinary part of the Vietnamese system. That's why we divided it.
And don't you think that this introduction coming from this process, basically stimulated by donors, etc., it's the same process that we saw in Brazil, that we see in Brazil happening. Don't you think that it's quite limiting the possibilities of Vietnam to develop an adequate SEA system? I mean, somehow it wouldn't be defining the basic pathway, the basic framework, and how can you see?
Yeah, I mean, there is of course a risk if you do it in a too squared way, that you come with your this is the way you do it, and then you say this is the way you do it, and then there is no room to align kind of the formal procedures with the informal kind of ways to do it. But I remember the only time I've been in Vietnam was in 2005. I was working we have this advisory services for the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, so we've been working on that, and they asked me then to take part in the OECD task in developing this guidance. So we had this one meeting in Halong Bay outside Hanoi, where we had representatives of quite a lot of Vietnamese. Were you with us then? No. But there were the MONRE representatives were there, and there was just a process where they were deciding on this, and you know, so they, at after a while we had all these discussions, you know from this conference, and then I remember the head of the IAIA department, he rose up and he said, now, you have to tell me, SEA, is it plant or is it animal?
Yeah.
It can't be both, You're telling me all this and problematizing here and there, and is it plant or is it animal? So they wanted to have, at that point of time, very clear instructions, or what is like. And they chose the kind of identified, should we go for an EIA type system, or should we go for more kind of sustainability appraisal assessment that they found that South Africa was working with? And they chose then the EIA type because they had this EIA system in place, and that was what they what felt natural to do. But I mean, it's a good question, and how flexible can development agencies be, and so on. When you're there, you want to produce some results with the money you invest, right? And that's not very easy to show. Yes?
I thought, well, really interesting, especially that.
Where are you from?
From the University of Manchester.
Okay.
And I think the institutional perspective is something similar that I tried to take with my research on the situation in England and Scotland. But I wonder whether you think, you mentioned that they're kind of asking about whether it's an animal or plant, they're interested in learning about SEA, about at the stage that I implemented right at the start and thinking already about the institutional aspect. Is there, do you think they will interested in kind of taking that view forward to kind of think about how they introduce it, or are they just going to kind of go ahead in anyway, and then they'll arrive at some institution 100 years down the line and realise that perhaps?
I think there's a trial. There is right now actually they have this new regulation, a revised regulation that changes the way SEA is to be done. But there is also conflict between, for example, the Minister of Planning of Investment, who think they're in charge of SEA, and the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, and they have different regulations, different plans and so on. And so it's not very well coordinated, and it's like a battle, if I understood. Yes?
Mikko also Integra Consulting. My question, you started with very interesting illustration about the time scale of change within institutional setting within the country. So from that perspective, the foreign involvement in Vietnam in helping in this development aid, focusing on development of SEA, it's what's the time span of this foreign involvement there? Is it 10 years or?
How long?
Yeah, how long will?
Well, actually, it's a very good question, and I think some of the development banks, they tend to come in very rapidly and do one pilot or one very substantive and short-term kind of intervention. Sweden has been working with Vietnam, all the way back since Olof Palme stood up for Vietnam during the war. And so Sweden has had very good relations with Vietnam, and the environmental cooperation goes back to the 70s. Actually, so they worked with different environmental projects and ministries, and from early 90s they worked structurally with the environmental ministries, with the IAIA and things like that. So that's been an extremely long-term support that has now ended. So that's the range of time, like 30, we have had this evaluation now, 30 years of development cooperation with Vietnam, and some of that has been around environmental issues. But the thing is, how quickly do institutions change? Oliver Williamson, with all respect, I think some norms may change much more rapidly. For example, if you take a recent example here in Europe and the US with the regulation of smoking at restaurants, etc. We can see quite rapid normative changes. Who has the right of a clean environment? Who has the right to smoke? So that's a much quicker change. So I think you could see that, but that's a very tricky question.
I was sort of thinking of whether the amount of and the focus of the help of the aid can compensate in some extent for the time that is needed to the change. Whether this certain development of towards the environmental appraisal of certain way, whether it wouldn't take place anyway, whether this foreign aid actually speeds up the introduction or adoption of the procedures, SEA-like procedures. Whether I don't know whether I made myself clear.
You're suggesting, are they learning from the process because they want to, or because they're just ticking a box to ensure that the money comes in, or the programs that they continue to receive the assistance? I think it's your question. Are they institutionalizing and learning from the process, or are they just taking and trying to just deliver outputs and outcomes on the basis of those pilots?
Yeah, the learning aspect is very crucial. Currently, I do not have a very good answer, actually.
I'm fascinated by this because the one area I don't see much research in is, are SEA practitioners making a difference through their own professional life as part of a team that's been created 6 years ago within a government, an arm's length government body. What I'm finding interesting now is that suddenly my team is under a lot of pressure because my agency wants us to do more. Because it's not necessarily just the SEA work that they appreciate, or hopefully they appreciate, but they're actually now calling us in more, in the case of the Colombian case, to solve problems. And we had a very interesting time last year where just a slight change in the exchange rate between the euro and the pound switched a lot of pig production from Denmark to the UK, and Czechoslovakia, we started doing from chickens from Czechoslovakia to the UK. And suddenly my agency was inundated with large poultry and pig permits. Now, I don't know what the breeding time, turnaround time on a chicken, but it's damn sight quicker than my permitting officers and my permitting colleagues turn around a permit. And they just couldn't cope, so we put together what we call a ZAP team, just get it shifted. And I put two of my team into a team of 16 people, and they worked together for a year. And at the end of the year, my two staff had shifted 45% of the permits. So in a team working together of 16 people, 2 people had shifted as good as half the permits. And we went, myself and the head of permitting went in and analysed this. Once I found out, and so how did the SEA practitioners or EIA practitioners prove more effective than trained permitting officers? And the answer was, Ross, you don't give me time to think, so I had to make decisions. And in SEA and EIA, you're constantly in a project environment and you have to make decisions. And I thought it was interesting that they turned to my colleagues in permitting, they just keep asking for more information. And I think a lot of government institutions do this, a lot of government ministries do, they just keep asking for more information from the environmental people. And the decision gets harder and harder to make, and you actually lose some perspective on what the issues they're dealing with. And culturally, I think it's going to be interesting how SEA, EIA practitioners, and I am interested, we touched upon it briefly, the separation of these two skill sets, because they are very different types of people. An EIA person is much more of a techie detail person, and SEA is a much more strategic, holistic thinker. And it's how we encourage these people not only to do the SEA job, but to embed within their ministries, within their consultancies, and be factors for change. I don't know if anyone else has got experience with sort of how practitioners are changing institutes.
How practitioners are?
How the introduction of SEA practitioners are beginning to change local authorities or regional authorities or government bodies. Because There's another example. We were audited recently by government, and we actually, to our surprise, we got a special, we got our highest rating in government, which is fantastic. But it was unexpected. The area they gave it to us was on reputational protection of government, which was an area we just didn't, we hadn't put our links together. They recognised the role that SEA now plays in protecting government reputation. Right.
I think one thing that could be done to increase the learning part of it is to look more on, going back a bit after we have monitoring and looking what were the results of these SEAs, or to do more evaluations and try to bring up lessons learned and get groups together. I don't know how much of that has been done in Vietnam. I haven't seen any such studies and so on, but I had opportunity to review kind of the final report from this Swedish support program, then to the collaboration with Monre on partly that was on strategic environmental assessment. And it seems, as in many cases, it's very activity and output focused reporting and also evaluation, and it's very difficult to talk about outcomes and the impact, of course, on environment, but outcomes, how much have people learned, how much have they changed their practices and things like that. But I think one thing also that can change the system quite rapidly is external stress, and Vietnam is under tremendous environmental pressure. So that will also, I think, show up and limit opportunities for growth and also human health and so on. So that, I think, can make the system work much better if there's realization of that we really need to change development path here. Do something. As climate change issue is a major issue for Vietnam with rising sea level.
Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, listener from EBRD. I know the speaker from Colombia isn't here, but just to make a point that we run into the same issues about in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union about not having any policy plan or program, and doing something like an SEA to inform them as they develop a